December 7th, 1941 is a day of historical importance for America, since it was a day of unexpected chaos that led to the awakening of the United States into World War II. This day of inescapable destruction represents the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which was America's naval fleet and aircraft base in Hawaii. This day signifies the horrendous consequences of an unavoidable eruption of war, how devastating the loss of honorable men can be, and when our country of different races can come together in a weakened state to support as well as fight for their beloved country. This state of eruption had triggered such a great impact on America. Since we did not take Japanese threats seriously enough, it caused a massive destruction of our Pacific Fleet. Although we tried hard to make peace treaties with Japan, our efforts failed because we did not take action soon enough. At that point, a war was inevitable, yet we did not want to face the facts. Therefore, that unstoppable war has made our country today more aware of the dangers of nuclear weapons and also more conscious of what we should act. The U.S. and Japan were not alone in engaging in activities which they knew would entice the other to enter the war. There were a number of events leading up to the bombing at Pearl Harbor, in fact, which could either be classified as a series of mistakes on the part of the Japanese or as a deliberate attempt by that country to entice the U.S. to war. The original intent by the Japanese was to deliver an ultimatum of war prior to the actual attack of the United States. Japanese Foreign Minister and the Navy Supreme Command, however, were unable to agree exactly what the ultimatum of war should be delivered to the United States. This would lead to one final act of negligence, which, along with the bombing itself, could not be but translate to U.S. involvement in World War II. On December 7, 1941, at 1 o'clock p.m., Washington time, it decided by the Japanese as the time at which the ultimate of war would be delivered to the United States. This timing was to allow 50 minutes prior to the actual bombing in order to give the United States time to agree to a compromise on the hull requirements and meeting international requirements regarding the declaration of war. What actually transpired in the house leading up to the bombing was a series of bumbles on the part of Japanese. These bumbles, however, which would directly translate into all-out war. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, everything was going normal as the Japanese bombers and torpedo planes approached the U.S. Pacific Fleet headquarters at Pearl Harbor to find them virtually defenseless. Sundays on the base were often spent at a more relaxed pace than usual. Crews rose late and officers often stayed ashore. On this day, almost all of the ship's guns were unmanned, and much of the ammunition was locked up. 2 of the 3 Pacific Fleet aircraft carriers were at sea. The third one was back in the United States being refitted.
At 7:55 a.m., the bombers and the attack planes broke into the calm morning skies. The first wave of Japanese planes arrived to find the base virtually defenseless. By the end of the second wave of planes, 2 hours later, 21 American ships had been sunk or damaged. Almost the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet had been decimated at the cost of only 29 Japanese planes. 5 of the 8 battleships stationed in the harbor that day were sunk. 11 smaller ships, including cruisers and destroyers, were also badly damaged. There were 2,335 servicemen and 68 civilians killed, and 1,178 people were wounded. The USS Arizona had the most casualties with 1,177 servicemen killed when a 1,700-pound bomb struck it, causing the ammunition on board to explode. Here's an example of the attack on Pearl Harbor from the movie Pearl Harbor, made in 2001. The United States Navy had been dealt a stunning blow by the Japanese, but it was not the overwhelming victory that the Japanese had thought it was, or it was going to be. One main reason was the failure to knock the American aircraft carriers out of action. The Japanese commander of the attack on Pearl Harbor only launched 2 waves of attacks on the American ships. He thought that the attack was an extreme victory by Japan and he did not need to launch more. The commander could have launched a 3rd wave, but decided not to. But by not launching the 3rd wave, he left many of Pearl Harbor's dockyards and oil storage tanks intact. If these would have been destroyed, the naval bases would have become useless. Another reason the attack was not that successful was that all of the battleships were attacked in shallow water. All but 2 of them were raised, repaired, and put back into service. If these ships had been forewarned, they would have been sent to battle and attacked in deep water, not only losing the ship, but the crew. The 2 Japanese delegates who had been assigned the task of delivering the ultimatum to Secretary Hull's office did not arrive until 2:20 p.m., over an hour after the Pearl Harbor attack had begun. This was only one of a series of falters which would precede the attack on Pearl Harbor. It, like most others, revolved around poor communication both with the Japanese government and between the Japanese and the United States. Each added to the decision-making process as to whether or not the U.S. should enter the war. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor occurred, of course, the Japanese failure to comply with international protocol regarding the declaration of war prior to a bombing was almost the main cause in terms of how it impacted the U.S.'s decision-making process to enter the war or not. While the decision-making process up until the time of the bombing could be said to have been rational, this rationality was thrown into a swirl of confusion, anger, and hatred once the bombing occurred. The American public was shocked that the sanctity of our nation's borders had been violated.
After the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the United States immediately went on the defensive. Action was taken to prevent an impending invasion on Hawaii and all other coastal locations. All Japanese-owned businesses were shut down, and Japanese residents in Hawaii were moved to detention centers. Shortly after the U.S. became involved in the Second World War, President Roosevelt signed an order for all Japanese American citizens to be bused to one of 10 relocation centers in the United States. The order was lifted in 1944. There were many other short-term effects after the attacks. One being entering the war almost immediately after the attacks. We felt like Japan was trying to push us around. We couldn't stand for that, so we declared war on them and entered the war. Another short-term effect was obviously us not having to be able to use our Navy because it had just been attacked and destroyed. With us not having our Navy ready and available right away, that was clearly a disadvantage in the war. The long-term effects, however, might outweigh the short-term effects. One long-term effect was the U.S. going to war where almost 417,000 Americans gave their lives. World War II was a bloody war in which 2.5% of the total world population was killed. Another long-term effect was the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the Japanese eyes, they did nothing wrong and they didn't think they deserved the bombings. A total of somewhere between 90,000 and 166,000 people were killed because of the bombings. Another long-term effect from the bombings in Pearl Harbor is the viewpoint of Americans towards the Japanese. There was a drastic change of views going towards the Japanese in a negative way, which is why we put them in internment camps. Overall, there are many short-term and long-term effects from the attack on Pearl Harbor, and many that have changed the country in many ways.
In conclusion, by bombing Pearl Harbor, the Japanese invoked not only the military might of the United States, but also her political and economic power. The most important strength that the U.S. had was the infuriated American people. This was a horrific attack on America and united everyone just as the World Trade Center attacks have done. Americans then and still today will not tolerate the killing of innocent people, especially with no forewarning. The attack on Pearl Harbor would ensure that the hostilities of the United States with Japan for at least the next 6 decades. The U.S. would not have let Japan enter the war without the U.S. itself entering, because that would have meant that the Axis powers would have complete control of Europe and Asia. With the strength, Germany's and Italy's ground forces, and Japan's navy, it would not have been long before the Axis powers took complete control of the world. The U.S. would have entered the World War II even without the attack on Pearl Harbor, but American casualties would have had a much higher number, and the war would have lasted much longer. And without the attack, American military forces would not have had the extra motivation for fighting gained from the attack on Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor will always be named as a day that will live in infamy.